Eugene, I wanted to talk to you a bit. I wanted to hear from you about updates on Sudan. But before we get updates on Sudan, because so much more violence has been unleashed just in the last few days, I was wondering if you could give, because I think people have a hard time wrapping their heads around Sudan. Can you give like a very brief? I'm talking. This is gonna be hard. Give like a 2 to 3 minute, because not everybody understands Sudan. Give a 2 to 3 minute just like explainer on how people should understand what the hell is going on in Sudan. Because there's a lot of information out there and none of it makes sense.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. And time me. I'm going to try to see if I can do this in 2 minutes. I mean, I think the easiest way to understand what's happening in Sudan is you have a battle over how a huge amount of resources are going to be distributed. In 2019, what you had in Sudan was this mass popular revolution that kicks off. This huge revolution all across the country. Millions of people are coming onto the streets. People may remember it. It brings down the government of the guy who had been the president since 1989 named al-Bashir. The basic issue at stake was twofold. It was about distribution of resources, what you may say vertically and horizontally. You had the general issues that just affect everyone everywhere in the globe, listing all capitalist nations where wealth is distributed mainly to a tiny handful of rich people and the vast majority of people are living in poverty, even though Sudan, like most other countries in Africa, is deeply rich in many mineral resources, agricultural resources. So that was one big motivation, is you had millions of people, especially young people under the age of 30, looking at their future for the next 30, 40 years, thinking like, wow, I do not want to live in abject poverty in my own country where there's a lot of wealth. So that was a big motivating issue. So that's vertically. The other issue is the distribution horizontally, because Sudan, big country, people may know, you look at it on the map, and the different regions of Sudan all have their own forms of mineral wealth. But historically, going way, 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 way back, this sort of tracks into British colonialism, which was in Sudan and different things. The tiny elite who hold things at the top also tend to be in one part of the country, more centrally to the country, closer to the River Nile. So in the west, in Darfur, in the eastern parts, and even some of the northern parts, and in the southern parts, you have a lot of wealth being created. But in addition to it only accruing to a tiny number of elites in those areas, most of it is actually accruing to the elites in the central part of the country. And so you also had people, even who were maybe not doing as bad or doing as poorly, or who themselves were able to benefit from some of the resources, saying there's a lot of unequal distribution, and that was a part of it too. So you had these two forces coming together, both from a vertical sense and from a horizontal sense, to say, let's change the country and let's do something significant. But what happens is there is a big interest that were challenged by this. The US, the European Union, and the Gulf states, who all have been benefiting heavily from the exploitation of resources in Sudan. And this popular revolution was saying, okay, the big agricultural subsidy, or the big agricultural giveaways to the Gulf states, we need to renegotiate that. The IMF debt slavery that the country is in, which is basically debt slavery to the US and Europe, we need to renegotiate and we need to change that. The possibility of normalization of Israel, and Sudan is one of the countries where people like hate Israel the most for basically, since Israel's been in existence, like we're definitely going to get rid of that, and there's going to be no normalization of Israel. And so it was a possibility of big changes, and they also were going to have political democracy, which for countries like Egypt is dangerous, because maybe people will get some idea of how their country should be run. So you have the Gulf states, you have Egypt, you have the US, you have the European Union, they all conspire to shut down this revolution and to put two sets of the military in charge. And the situation we have now, and this is where I'll end, is because those two sets of the military then couldn't agree on how to distribute the spoils, so they went to war with one another. And so now that is the war that is happening between the traditional army, the RSF, and each side has a range of actors regionally and internationally supporting them.
And what has happened in the last few days? They're saying that there's been just like 30,000 people killed, which is a crazy number to think of just happening in a few days. What's happening? What's the escalation right now?
So the escalation right now is twofold, and the piece you're talking to is around the fall of al-Bashir, which is basically like the biggest city in the northern part of Darfur, and it was the only part that the army controlled versus the RSF. So the RSF had put it under siege, they were starving people out, and then it seems that the army basically figured that they could not hold it, and so at least as reports say, they started to leave. The RSF goes into al-Bashir, and like they've done in pretty much every city they've taken over like this, they then start conducting a huge massacre. No one knows exactly how many people have been killed. It's at least 7,000, could be as much as 30,000. And the reason we don't know the number is because a lot of people were able to just kind of flee in the chaos, but the RSF was tracking people down as they were starting to flee and killing them before they could get to safety. And a huge number of refugees have just not emerged from the desert. So it's unclear, are some of these people still alive, and are they hiding? Are they trying to get there? Or were they killed? Or have they, at least if they were not killed directly by the RSF, did they die of hunger or thirst or something of that nature, which is certainly very possible. People have been were taken out of hospitals in al-Bashir and just executed. There are videos that were emerging of RSF fighters, and this is how we know it's happening. A lot of them were filming themselves killing people, and that was a big piece. And then now it's expanded because the fall of al-Bashir meant that RSF has now reopened its offensives in a place called Kordofan, which is another part of Sudan, and the fighting is very serious there. And you have a lot of killing of civilians on both sides, but the RSF, the way they operate, is more of a terroristic style, ethnic cleansing style of how they do things to try to cow people into submission with great severity of what they do. So they have been responsible for significantly more war crimes. Some things I think could be phrased as genocide. And so now we're seeing a very difficult situation. But today they actually announced they want a 3-month truce because it's probably not that likely they can take over the whole country right now. And so the Libya scenario, which is one that the US seems to be heavily backing right now, seems to be what RSF is playing for. If they can freeze the conflict under allegedly humanitarian reasons, because that's why they say they want the ceasefire to open up, aid portals, that they can use that time to rearm, to regroup, and get themselves together, and then undoubtedly launch more offensives, against the army, which is now rejecting this because they're saying, well, there's no point in having a truce. It's just going to divide the country and, allow them to rearm and refuel, which even though it's sort of self-interested for the army to say that, it's definitely true. So you've got sort of a bitter fight to the end kind of scenario, but the US has been doing a lot in the past several weeks to try to put pressure on all sides, both internally and in the countries surrounding Sudan and also in the region, to force this Libya-style scenario so that they can say they've brought peace.
And then the last thing I'll ask before we move on here, so just briefly, is there's been a lot of attention to the Emirati role in helping to fuel this war. So can you just kind of give a bit of a short explainer on what's going on there?
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, UAE has been tabbed by a lot of people because they are the number one supporter of the RSF. They seem to be basically motivated by the fact that they think that the RSF succeeding is going to give them better access to business deals and the like there in Sudan. I mean, they already had quite a bit going on in Sudan, but they weren't the only ones. Obviously Saudi Arabia is big there, Kuwait's big there, a lot of countries are big there, Egypt, other countries, Russia was in there. So there's a lot of other countries in there, and it seems like the UAE has bet on RSF as being a force like other forces in the sort of broader Horn of Africa region that are going to kind of let them in the door a little bit more. At least that seems to be what's motivating them. It's hard to understand what else could be motivating them than the huge amount of money that can be brought. Sudan has a lot of gold, UAE the number one gold producer, the big agricultural industries, gum Arabic, which a lot of people don't know about, but Google that, very expensive thing, cattle, all these things that they make a lot of money off of, that they will be able to get the number one role. And they've been able to exploit the fact that there are others in the region that have their own orientation, like Chad, for instance, which is, actually just got a bunch of billions of dollars of business deals from UAE that, that's helping them on that front. But a lot of the countries in the region, there's a long history between Sudan and these countries. So the leader of Chad, for instance, is in the same tribe as the leader of the RSF. And there's always been a lot of back and forth between Sudan, Darfur, and Libya, between different people trying to put different people in charge. So the leadership of Chad fears, well, RSF could actually turn against us and maybe take us out of power. So it also helps us, not just financially with the UAE, but in terms of the power politics of the region. You've got Haftar in Libya, same thing. Power politics of the region, in addition to access to Sudanese resources. So UAE has been able to play on this combination of people wanting to profit off Sudan, but also having their own fears of what an empowered Sudanese government could mean for their own rule in different ways, to mobilize regional forces to support them. But really, you can see UAE seems to be dominated mainly by controlling the region. And a lot of their moves all across the Horn of Africa right now, and actually the whole African continent, seem to be very much about solidifying their role as kind of like a powerful economic interlocutor for the great wealth that is generated in Africa, and which, sort of the future of the 21st century in many ways will hinge upon, which is why you have the US, Europe, and China kind of locked in this battle over influence in Africa as well.
Well, Eugene, I really appreciate that. We're going to keep coming back to this issue, which gets like no attention.